Yeah.
Will it be due on Monday?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yes.
Is it individual?
I don't know. Yes.
Will we do it every time for a test, or
I don't know.
do you know anything about it?
I know that we're about ready to begin. Let's go ahead and join me in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. The Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Not bad. Not bad. We have, oh no! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to do these 5 things. If by the end of class you cannot do these 5 things, then I have failed you as a teacher. I'll do my best. Please do your best. Would somebody like to read number 8, please? Thank you, Tess.
Give examples of the 20th century leisure activities and walking.
Yes, when we go into the 1900s, into the 20th century, we're going to talk about like what people kind of just did for fun. What was leisure, what was popular sports. Like, we could talk about the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, and we will, but that's not, like, most people are not political. We live lives. So let's talk about kind of what life was like. Would somebody like to read number 9, please? Thank you, Maria.
Analyze the spread of mass culture in the United States at the turn of the 20th century.
Yes, we're going to talk about the emerging mass culture. For the first time in American history, really for the first time in world history, there is enough of a human network that you could create mass culture. So we could say, like, what's American culture like? Really, until you get to the 1900s, until you get to the turn of the 20th century, you have Southern culture, you could have New England culture, you could have Western culture, but there's nothing that it means to be an American. But we have built enough of a human network that you could have mass culture. We'll talk about how that spreads in the 20th century. Would somebody like to read number 10, please? Thank you, Emma.
Describe turn of the 20th century innovations in marketing and advertising.
Yes. This is the forerunner of the ad campaign. Would somebody like to read number 11, please? Yeah, thank you.
Describe the growing presence of women in the workplace at the turn of the 20th century.
Yes, we take a somewhat of a topical shift from what's popular culture to the emerging role of women in the social spheres. In particular, we'll talk about the workforce. Somebody like to read number 12, please? Yeah, thank you, Austin.
Identify leaders of the women's suffrage movement and explain how suffrage was achieved.
Yes, today we're going to get a little incongruous with the timeline. Today we're going to talk about women's suffrage, the movement for the women's right to vote, which really happens kind of at the end of the progressive era, but it's a progressive issue, and so we'll put it here and follow the storyline to its end. Women's suffrage doesn't really happen very timely with the rest of the unit, but just to go ahead and finish that storyline so we don't leave it as a dangling thing, we'll talk about it here. So when you go home tonight and your parents say, "What did you learn in school today?" you don't have to look at them and say, "Nothing," like you've been saying since you were 8. Instead, you could say, "Well, Mother, well, Father, shall we give examples of turn-of-the-century leisure activities and popular sports?" And they'll say, "Why, yes, child, that'll make a thrilling dinner-time conversation." You'll have something to talk about. How exciting will that be? Huh? So exciting indeed.
So exciting.
So exciting. There you go. Get excited. Get Roman numeral number 8. A couple of classes ago, we talked about how Frederick Law Olmsted goes and sets up New York City with the Central Park as the jewel of the city, the emerald in the middle of the urban jungle, and it's very influential. Every large city begins setting aside particular specific green space for use of recreation. Playgrounds, ball fields, just places to be people. Kansas City, like our first real great urban park was Luce Park in Kansas City, Missouri. It's south of the plaza. It's awesome. It's a great place to. There's people go and get like wedding pictures there because the central rose garden is really pretty. It's also kind of a nice place. Go grab a frisbee and just go run around. There's ducks in the pond. Don't feed the ducks. At least don't feed them bread. Everybody wants to feed ducks bread. It's like total poison for them. It's nutritionally worthless for a duck. Yeah, and then they don't eat like real food. What's that? Yeah, we're really hurting them bad. Don't give ducks bread. You can give them bird feed or they sell it in stores. Okay, I'm sorry that I've just ruined your visions of hanging out with the ducks. All right. Also, amusement parks. Amusement parks began to be built on the outskirts of cities. Kansas City had a real famous one called Electric Park, but every major city ends up getting like amusement parks and just entertainment, which they're not built in the urban core. They're kind of on the outskirts of town, sort of on the edges towards the country. Trolley car companies would sometimes build them. So like it's the transit company that's building the amusement park, not necessarily because the amusement park makes money, although they hope it to, but because you had to go like buy a trolley ticket to get there. They're just trying to encourage people to use transit. The amusement parks usually had picnic grounds, fun rides. The most famous of them, Coney Island, introduced roller coasters in 1884. By 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, there they debuted the Ferris wheel, which you might think of a Ferris wheel as kind of a lame ride. It's actually sort of a thrill ride. If you've never been on one because you think it's like an old person's ride, it's pretty unnerving to be on a Ferris wheel. Go to the one at Old Shawnee Days, because it's probably dangerous. Run by a presumably not meth addict who's probably did safety checks. Maybe. That's the thrill ride. Okay, so point B. Bicycles. Early bicycles were actually pretty dangerous. The big high wheel bikes were pretty, you had to get onto them like on a stool and sort of a hopping mount to get up there. They're hard to ride. They don't steer very well because you're sitting over the wheel. So they're pretty tricky to ride. So early bicycles were dangerous. And so at first bicycling is like, it's all dudes because men do dangerous things. That's why women live longer. Even then you kind of have a daredevil because you might fall and you might crack your skull open. Pretty dangerous. But then like the safety bike, which is what you think of as like a bicycle. This was called the safety bike that tries to balance out the ratio of the wheels and changes the way the gears operate. Much easier to ride, and then biking for a brief period of time becomes America's favorite way to get around. And so with safer bicycles, women began to ride bikes. But ladies are not wearing pants or shorts, they're wearing dresses, and so you have to modify the bicycle so girls can ride it, which is why like the girls' bike gets invented that has like the low bar that comes down, so you could ride it in a skirt or a dress and not be inappropriate of having the whole thing thrown over the middle crossbar onto it. Abandoning the tight corsets and big fluming dresses like that, it just didn't seem appropriate for something like that. What begins as like sporting wear, that women are wearing more tailored dresses that aren't like so tight and moving around. Eventually it became everyday wear. It goes from like sports clothes to just like how women are dressing. They're not wearing the big poofy things and tight up corsets anymore. Susan B. Anthony, our famous suffragist, once said that I think cycling has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. Cycling gives women a freedom and self-reliance. Yeah. Who knew? The bicycles, man, the first step in women's suffrage. Tennis was a British sport, but Americans loved it, and becomes really popular really quickly. Becomes popular quickly, and we'll talk in a future class about some kind of like early athletes, basically women's sports. The first superstars of women's sports come in swimming and tennis. Sporting life also gets like Hershey's and Coca-Cola would say that these were health foods. because Hershey's has a lot of sugar in it, and cocoa is a bean, so it's like a vegetable. More sustaining than meat, they would claim. I'm not sure that's true. Or Coca-Cola, with all of its zip of caffeine and sugar, and for a brief time cocaine, became brand name refreshments for an active life. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's made out of the coca leaf. Yeah, not cocoa, the bean, coca. Yeah, the early versions of Coca-Cola had a nominal amount, not like a huge amount, but had a nominal amount of cocaine. It was a medicine. You could only get it in drugstores, like the soda jerk that would have it. That's the reason that only comes in drugstores, because it was a controlled substance. That's what?
That's what I'm telling my parents.
Yeah, good. That's well, mother. Well, father. Yeah, sit down. Open a can of Coke. Yeah. No, it's not in there anymore. It's just mostly corn syrup now. Just drink a can of wet corn. So point C. Americans began avid fans of spectator sports. By the turn of the century, boxing and baseball were profitable businesses. In 1845, I didn't know that was going to pop up like that. Alexander Cartwright organized a baseball club. In 1845, organizes set rules for play. Now, he doesn't invent baseball. Versions of baseball had existed kind of the Civil War. But when it gets organized into leagues and it's not just some diversion to play while trying to shoot at Southerners, it's like 1845 is kind of when this gets organized into really leagues of play. And it emerges by 1876 that the I got my timeline wrong. 1845 was before the Civil War. I'm reading several lines at the same time ahead. So 1845, Cartwright sets down the rules of play. He's not the father of baseball, but he's kind of the father of baseball. We also say that Doubleday was the father of baseball, but yeah.
Whenever it has baseball as two different words, when did that get switched? So,
they're still using it in two words into the 20th century. I'm not sure when it just becomes baseball. Yeah, for a while it was baseball. Yeah, it's true. Okay, the National League formed in 1876. The American League formed in 1900. Sometimes you'll still hear old-timers call the National League the senior circuit, because it's just a few years older than the American League before they merged into Major League Baseball. These were two rival leagues that were both trying to compete for interest. Discrimination led to the Negro Leagues, which was a totally different set of leagues for black players, because obviously they just couldn't play together. In Kansas City, the Kansas City Monarchs, we get a lot of it in Kansas City. We get a lot of Monarch stuff. But Monarchs were one of the premier teams in the whole country. To play for the Monarchs was like playing for the Yankees in the 90s. There was cachet to it. The Monarchs player. There's also... Monarchs are also kind of an exception. Most of the Negro Leagues teams had kind of insulting names, as if always kind of taking a secondary role in society. Monarchs were sort of rare, because the monarch is not the butterfly. That's the kings, right? But the Indianapolis Clowns, there's a few of those that they're not really complimentary names, but yeah, Kansas City was kind of a rare one to be the Monarchs. Yeah, Roman numeral number 6. We also see those newspapers, which we've been talking about for a few weeks now, at the turn of the 20th century become big business and make it possible for mass culture to spread because of publication happening on a big scale. Mass circulation newspapers, it's not good journalism. It's yellow journalism. They're using those sensational headlines to capture readers. The whole Spanish-American War was drummed up by bad journalism, yellow journalism, which was about you got Hearst's line, right? He tells Remington, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. Just go draw something and we'll make a story around it. It's not really what you call journalism today, but they're pretty seedy and drummed up. The New York Journal, Hearst's paper, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. This would probably not be a headline that would run today. This whole thing is to get people all fired up. Or Pulitzer's New York World, things that were sensational stories that, like, this woman jumps from the Brooklyn Bridge, survives the mad leap. Front page story of a newspaper. This is not news. This is like a personal crisis, right? This is not front page of a New York newspaper. But it's sensational and people are like, ooh, what's that? It's the clickbait of the 20th century, right? Like, this is not it. It gets people excited. Pulitzer bought the New York World, used it to pioneer popular innovations such as a bigger newspaper on Sundays, which I even remember as a kid, back when people had newspapers. The Sunday paper was huge. You needed a different size bag to throw it on your front. We have 29 people, 30 including me. How many people in this room actually get a subscription newspaper delivered to their house every day? You get the Kansas City Star or the Times or something like that. 1, 2, an actual daily newspaper. 2 people in here. Okay. Yeah? When I was a kid, I remember when Kansas City had 2 major papers, the Kansas City Times that came out in the morning and the Star came out in the afternoon. My folks got 2 newspapers delivered a day to their house. Every major town had several of these.
My grandpa does.
Yeah?
Every time I'll see him on like Saturday. Like, did you see St. James won the football game? Or?
I did see that. Yeah. All right. So, large Sunday edition. Pulitzer invents like the comic pages, sports coverage, women's news. William Randolph Hearst's model was we would sell sin, sex, and sensation. Or Pulitzer tried to outrun. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Pulitzer, sin, sex, and sensation tried to outsell Hearst. Basically, just run all of the appealing stories, even if they're just newsy. William Randolph Hearst also had the San Francisco papers. He would exaggerate stories, build them all up. Wild stories of scandal, cruelty, sometimes just outright made-up stories. Hearst had a long-running segment about conquering Mars and like setting up a huge, like a human colony on Mars. All of it to outsell Pulitzer. By 1900, every major city had at least one art gallery. Many art galleries and libraries tried to raise the cultural standards of the city. Kansas City, our own city, was not a huge city in 1900. We were not a dinky little town, but we were not like a major city. It wasn't the total backwater that Kansas Cityans sometimes still think our city is. But still, we didn't have any major art gallery until 1915. When the Kansas City Star publisher William Rockhill Nelson left his entire estate to go purchase an art gallery for the city. So like when Nelson died, he left every penny he had, not to his heirs, but to the city to go start an art gallery. About the same time, Mary Atkins was another like old money woman in town. She also died. She also left her estate to start an art gallery. There were supposed to be 2 different art museums. The city rolled them together and opened the Nelson Atkins, which, for my money, is one of the greatest art galleries in the Midwest. I've been to a lot of art museums. I married a woman with a fine arts degree. It's kind of what we do when we go see other towns. We just see what the art gallery, what the art museum is like in town. The Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, Kansas City, is one of the finest art galleries in the Midwest and rivals some of the big ones in other bigger cities than ours. It's a great gallery. You should go see it. It's a shame that you visited in 5th grade on a field trip and never go back. You should go. Nelson Atkins Museum of Art is awesome. Artists like Thomas Eakins, this guy giving you the creepy eye in the bottom left corner. Thomas Eakins and other artists of the turn of the 20th century lead a new art movement which switches from kind of this like romanticized vision of America. So like you've got, I don't know, the old Hudson River School, which painted these landscapes of sort of like the beautiful side of nature, and it was kind of this romanticized, dreamy, what America should look like. Or the Western artists, where they're like Frederick Remington and his bucking bronco and the excitement of the West, but it's, you know, it's kind of a charmed up version. Eakins and other artists of the day wanted to be realists. They tried to promote life as it is. Eakins went and studied anatomy with medical students. He's like using math and geometry. It's almost like a new renaissance, right? To imagine like more realistic paintings to it. Photographs, which had existed by this point for 40 years. He's using photographs in his art to, like, you know, repaint from the images so he doesn't have to drag the easel out into the field and paint it. He's taking pictures and going back to the studio to produce realistic paintings on it. To make it more and more so, he becomes one of the main figures of the Ashcan school, which was about painting urban life and working people. It's a no-frills, gritty, warts and all kind of approach to art that shows urban living that a lot of people wanted to overlook. They wanted to see the pretty sides, but the Ashcan school says, no, this is the real side of it. And you can't just romanticize away the dirt and the grime and the smell and the sound and the clamor. You can't just romanticize that stuff away. Thomas Eakins, his most famous painting, we used to get this in Scholars Bowl every now and then. It's called the Gross Clinic, which was not gross like ew, it was named gross. It was the Gross Clinic, and it was an anatomy session, and he like watched med students cut open people and then painted it because he's like, that's kind of awesome. George Bellows, the Cliff Dwellers that we saw earlier. My favorite Bellows piece is Stag at Sharkeys. It's a boxing match. Bellows did this kind of stuff all the time. Bellows was like a manly artist where people fought and there's like dirt and whatever. But Stag at Sharkeys is not a pretty painting. You don't look at that and say, oh, it's so beautiful. You look at it and you go like, I bet that is sweaty. That is loud and cheering and screaming, and it's the energy of it, right? Robert Henri, his Snow in New York. Here we see kind of a shift. This is a more of the Impressionist mode, where things look a little cloudier and smudgier. It doesn't look like a photograph. This is more like the Impressionist style with the thick, chunky brush strokes. You imagine if you're looking at this, you can actually see the clunks of the paint is kind of built up onto it. But again, it's the Ashcan. It's show the dirty side, show the ugly stuff. Don't just show the pretty things. Also want to include probably Henri's most famous painting is the Mary Agnes portrait, which is again sort of Impressionist, but she's not some like rich baroness. The last thing before we move on is John French Sloan. He is also an Ashcan. He's also a realist. The fact that he goes into a tavern to go paint a bar, like this is not high art. This is kind of a seedy underbelly kind of thing. The McSorley's bar, he's watching like men drinking during the day. This is not, it's Ashcan, you know? It's not pretty stuff and beautiful scenes. It's kind of an ugly side. Okay, popular fiction. By 1900, the United States had thousands of free circulating libraries. Andrew Carnegie, whom we met earlier in a different unit, Carnegie of Carnegie Steel, was a fabulously wealthy man, one of the richest men of his era, and there were some rich men in his era. He left almost his entire estate to go found, well, he's actually still alive in the later years, to go found libraries. He'd say, towns need libraries, you should have libraries. And so he would build the building, leave them an endowment to go buy some books, and then leave it to the town to go start with. He had founded thousands of Carnegie libraries, a lot of which in Kansas in particular are still in use, particularly in the small towns that wouldn't otherwise build a library. My favorite one is in Lawrence. It's the former Lawrence City Library. It was a Carnegie library built in 1902. I think it's just pretty. It's kind of cool. But America is very literate, and we like dime novels. Dime novels are not high art. They're just kind of dumb books to read for fun, back when people read for fun. And they're not like literature. They're cowboy stories and detectives. And like this one, I mean, the guy's holding a lit stick of dynamite while guns. I would watch this movie, but before this movie, I would read this book. It's just kind of fun. It's not literature. It's just simple books, fun books. Mark Twain, Samuel Longhorn Clemens, rejected high culture. If you read Mark Twain books, they are not hoity-toity high culture. A lot of times he's actually kind of making fun of high culture. You read something like A Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court, he's totally rejecting all of that. He loves sort of American Western spunkiness. He thinks that's the fun stuff. Yet in a real twist of irony, Twain is now considered like America's great first literature writer, and we teach him in schools. That probably would have really pissed off Mark Twain. Roman numeral number 7, or next. Roman numeral number next. I kind of fell out of order. Is it 7? No, 10. Okay. In 1890, the first shopping center opens in Cleveland, the predecessor of a mall. And people my age remember when malls were pretty awesome. It was a 5-story, glass-topped building called an arcade. An arcade is a building made out of arches. It's not just like a place in the 80s where people played video games. That's not an arcade. An arcade is a building made out of a series of arches. It's like arcade is the thing. The first one opens in Cleveland. It's basically like a mall, but it's, there's bands and a department store and anchors. The Cleveland Arcade is still there today. I don't know if it's still an active shopping center, but the building's still there today. In other cities, retail shopping districts formed near transit routes and public transportation. In 1865, which is not really this era, but we'll start it in Chicago in 1865, Marshall Field, which was a person, opened the first U.S. department store in Chicago. Marshall Field said, men make all the money in the country, but women spend all the money in the country. So why don't we make a store which caters to women? And he sets up that shopping is a pleasant pastime for women to go do. And his motto was, give the lady what she wants. If she wants a nice open store, we'll make an open store. If men like to just swoop in and grab something and swoop out, men aren't our customers. And so Marshall Field caters to women's shopping, invents the bargain basement where there's the Walmart in the basement. Chain stores show up by the 1970s, and the best of them is Woolworth's. F.W. Woolworth says chain stores could have the same merchandise that local shops could have, but you buy in bulk when you're running several stores. And unlike Marshall Field's, which catered to the whims of the middle class or rich women shopper, Woolworth's is not personal service. There's stuff on the shelf. You go get it if you will want it. It's like the difference between going into Target, where you just gotta go find the thing, and you probably know where it is, and you'll probably figure it out, or you guys aren't old enough to go out furniture shopping yet, but one day you're going to walk into Nebraska Furniture Mart, and you're just going to want to go look for a couch. And you are going to get swarmed by these salespeople that follow you around, and every 15 feet say, can I help you find something? No, I'm looking at couches. I can find the couch. They drive you crazy. Woolworths did not have that at all. It was just it's over on the shelf. Go get it. No personal service. Do it as cheap as possible. And there was a certain segment of Americans that loved. This is probably how men shop. Just leave me alone. I'll find it on the shelf. And Woolworths, really successful. By 1911, they had almost 600 stores and were doing $1 million in sales every week in 1911 dollars. In 1865, at the crest of the Civil War, in 1865, businesses all across the country spent $10 million in advertising. By the end of the century, it was 95 million. The biggest advertising spenders were in patent medicines, which was over-the-counter kind of medicines, soaps, baking powders. Advertising began putting everywhere. Periodicals, magazines, newspapers, billboards, the whole side of a building would be painted as an advertisement. In 1872, a catalog began distributed called Ward's Catalog. Was a single sheet of paper. The original Ward's Catalog, a single sheet of paper, was distributed. About that same time, Richard Sears opened up his mail order catalog. By the turn of the century, Montgomery Ward's and Sears Roebuck had taken over the like consumer mail order stuff market. They're the Amazon of their day. And it's made possible by a development of the post office called rural routes and rural free delivery, that they will bring you the stuff. You know, if you're out on the farm and you got to go to the store to go buy, I don't know, not urgent things, a new couch or a watch, that was quite a trip. Travel wasn't very easy. Not everybody has cars, particularly out in the farms, you know. We'll talk about cars later. But it was tricky, so that the post office would bring you the stuff. This is still great. Wahlberg family, like we're kind of an Amazon overkills. Like I'm running out of toothpaste. I could put this in the Target list. I have it sitting on my front step in a day and a half. You know, like that's the way you buy toothpaste right there. You bring it to me. Yeah, Wahlberg's kind of overkill that probably. In terms of women, before the Civil War, only middle class and upper class women devoted themselves to a home or family. Before the Civil War, the only like stay-at-home mom was a person that had a certain amount of wealth. To be upper middle class or certainly rich women, everybody else, women would go to work at some level. And the jobs were all about the same kind of jobs. They're domestic service jobs. They're maids, they're cooks, they're working for a rich family somewhere else. Poor women basically all have to go work for wages outside the home. On farms, particularly in the South and in the Midwest, women's roles hadn't significantly changed since the founding of the country. Women's roles basically hadn't changed much. Women were performing all the household tasks like cooking and making clothes and laundering, raising livestock, helping with the plowing and harvesting crops. The women are out there running the tractor as well as running home to go make the dinner, right? So like in the cities, only rich people could stay at home. In the farms, nobody does. Better paying jobs, though, began to emerge in the cities, and after the year 1900, 1 in 5 women held jobs, 25% of which was in the higher paying field of manufacturing. Rather than domestic service of cleaning and raising kids and cooking, a factory job could pay a little bit more than that. And so 25% of which women are working in manufacturing. Even if women couldn't be in a labor union, they could still get manufacturing jobs. Half of employed women were working in the garment business, making clothes, and yet they're working in the lowest skilled jobs, making half of men's wages. Making clothes became a significant employer of women, being able to sew and working like industrial garment production, but they don't get paid very well. And employers basically assume that men are the ones supporting the families. The men have to get paid more because men are the ones supporting their families. Even though women need the job to also support the family, the feeling is that like women make the extra money, not the money. So we don't need to pay them as much as men. Other than clothes making, women held jobs in why does that that's dumb. Whoops. That's the only thing on this slide. Women held jobs in offices, stores, and classrooms. And to hold a job in an office, a store, or a classroom, it required a high school education. And so women are encouraged to stay in school. And it's pretty successful. By 1890, women were graduating high school at a faster rate than men. So much so that women graduates were outnumbering men. That has been unchanged for 125 years. Women graduate school at a far greater rate than like girls than boys, and then into college. Colleges graduate more women than men do, than men graduate. There was new business schools training women to be shopkeepers and stenographers and typists, but without a formal education. If you don't go through schooling, women mostly found employments in the ways that women have always found employment, as cooks or cleaners. In 1870, 70% of women did domestic work. And in particular, let's look at African American women. In the years after slavery, 2 million African American women were pushed into the workforce, mostly in domestic work, mostly in houses, right alongside unmarried immigrant women. Roman numeral next. My numbering is way off on this. I think we hit a little glimpse of this previously. It was in the video that we watched. I kind of wish we would have talked about it before now. It's the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It's one of the deadliest industrial disasters even still in all of American history. So a shirtwaist was a type of garment when women wore long dresses. They're like long skirts. They would wear short shirts, usually kind of poofy sleeves, and then the long dresses, like the long skirts, meant that the shirt was kind of a short garment that came above the belly button, the top of the neck, and they're like the big poofy shirts that come out. And it was the fashionable garment for women in the modern age. By 1911, fashions had changed. The bicycle was changing styles. Women began to get more sporting. The old corsets and high-waisted dresses, it was done. That was old dowdy fashion. And the Triangle Factory was one of the last places that was still making this style of shirt in 1911. And Triangle Shirtwaist was not a good place to work. In a lot of garment factories, it was kind of the same, where all the managers are men, and they believe that the women are probably going to either steal stuff, or being women that just can't keep up with the work, they'd be flaking out, trying to go take breaks on the clock, sneak out and steal wage money by getting paid for time they're not working. And so the managers, this is not good business practice, and it's certainly not safe. They began to lock the doors so people couldn't leave. When people did leave, they had to go through the central place where women would be searched to see if they were stealing things, sneaking stuff out. And so you got to control the flow of people. The building was crowded. It was full of sewing machines, which are greasy, and you got to oil them all the time. And the air is full of cotton dust, and the whole building is explosive and crowded. And all the fire escapes are blocked shut. And it's a perfect storm. And on March 25th, 1911, a fire breaks out on the, 7th floor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th floor. And starts ripping up the stairwell. People on the 7th floor try to escape, but they find that the door has been locked. The fire is climbing up through the building. People on the lower levels also have a hard time getting out. It's not clear to them that the building is on fire. There's no sprinklers, there's no alarms, there's no way to even tell the 3rd floor that the 7th floor is on fire. And as the fire spreads, 146 garment workers were killed that day. 123 of which were women and girls, 23 of which were men, died from the fire itself, the smoke inhalation, or by trying to jump to their safety, but jumping to their deaths. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, became famous for its call for workplace safety reform. You can't make death trap buildings. You can't force people to work into their death. It was a call for labor reform and the growth of women's labor unions. Women couldn't have even organized for better treatment because there were no labor unions that would take women workers until the Shirtwaist Fire said that it can't continue like this. In 1910, women's clubs, there was about 500,000 of them nationwide organizing for reform groups to promote social causes. Might come back to that. Many women became active in public life and attending new women's colleges. Vassar College opened up in 1865, Smith College and Wellesley College a few years later. All of the big colleges, Columbia, Brown, Harvard, the Ivies, they all refused to admit women. And each college established a women's college nearby, collectively known as the Seven Sisters. So Vassar would be related to some other Ivy League school, the Seven Sisters. Columbia, the last to admit women, was really late. I think it's the 60s when Columbia finally said, all right, fine, women can go to school here. Really held out. It's 50% of college-educated women never married. Whether their education convinced them they didn't need a man or convinced men that they didn't need a woman smarter than them, half of college-graduating women never got married, instead putting their efforts into social reform, which leads us to subpoint C. Women reformers targeted workplace health and safety, and it was pretty obvious this was a need. And education, housing reform, food and drug reform. Because women couldn't vote or hold office, the only way to change the world is to do it by rousing rabble and through changing themselves, to making their own change because they couldn't trust the ballot box to change it for them. African American women established parallel organizations because they often weren't welcome in mainstream white women's organizations. So you have the National Association of Colored Women, dedicated to the moral education of minorities, managing nurseries and kindergartens and education for black people. Susan B. Anthony, that says Elizabeth Cady Stanton twice on there. One on the left is Susan B. Anthony. She's awesome. She gets her own name. Susan B. Anthony. That's a sad typo. Sorry, Suze. Susan B. Anthony was a leading crusader for women's suffrage, arguing for the right to vote. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded an organization called NASA, N-A-W-S-A, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, to promote equality at the ballot box, to let women go vote alone. Suffrage does not mean suffering. It sounds like it. Women's suffrage is not about getting women to suffer. Suffrage is a legal term for the right to vote. Arguing for women's suffrage is arguing for women to be allowed to vote. Yeah.
Have you seen the movie Here Comes the Moon?
No, I have not. Sorry. Okay. And women faced a constant opposition to suffrage. Some feared that if women got the right to vote, the first thing they would do would be to outlaw alcohol. Prohibition was a political movement at the time. The biggest prohibition advocates were for women, and they said, if we just let women vote, they're going to outlaw booze. And men kind of looked at each other askance and said, that will never happen. And we were afraid that women would try to outlaw alcohol. Others said, you know what, if women get jobs, if women go get the right to vote, then their bleeding, soft, mealy hearts, because women are so silly, they'll outlaw child labor. Because women care about stuff like that. They're not cold and savage like men. So if we're like women, what are they going to do? They're going to take away all our booze. They're going to make me fire all these kids. And why would I let women vote? Others feared that, the worst part is that once they go out voting and stuff, women are going to want a bigger role in society. Convincing state legislatures to give the right to vote, it started with Wyoming in 1869. This sometimes surprises people that Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote. It doesn't sound very liberal-minded. The swinging metropolis of Wyoming. Equality state of the future, right? Wyoming figured out that Wyoming doesn't have a lot of people in it. They still don't have a lot of people in it, still a state with more cows than humans, right? But they said, Wyoming was like, how do we convince women to move to Wyoming? You know what the ladies love? Voting. And it was like trying to populate the state. Utah, Colorado, Idaho, the western states, but don't pack up yet, we're still in class. The 13th, that's a typo in number 2. The goal was to test the 14th Amendment. I don't know what that sentence means. I kind of chopped that up there. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause said that states might lose their representation if they denied men the right to vote. So Susan B. Anthony led an attempt to try that amendment, to go see if they could get some legal movement on this, to see if women also had protection under the 14th Amendment. They tried to vote, so women just tried to show up at the ballot box and vote 150 different times around the country, saying hey, the 14th Amendment provides equal protection of the laws. I'm a person, I get equal protection. They didn't have the right to vote, and it got people arrested, and voting became, attempting to vote became a socially disruptive thing that could get a person thrown in jail. Susan B. Anthony was the biggest agitator of this. In 10 states and in Washington, D.C. in 1875, the Supreme Court of the United States had to rule on this 14th Amendment and the women's right to vote. They ruled that women, yes, are actual citizens, that's true, but denied the idea that citizenship automatically brings the right to vote. This is still true. Citizenship does not mean the right to vote. You are citizens, and none of you have the right to vote, right? You're not old enough yet. Citizenship doesn't automatically do it. There might be reasons why somebody would lose their right to suffrage, too. Famously, in a lot of states, being a felon means that you lose the right to vote. Pushing the constitutional amendment to vote, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had the amendment introduced in 1878, but it failed for 41 years.
Oh, yikes.
I know, right?